In Unit 8, we move past working with 2 notes at a time, as we did for intervals, to begin working with 3 notes at a time. A chord in music is a combination of 3 or more notes. Here's a chord, and here's another, and here are 3 more. Now, while all these are chords, the ones at the right are special kinds of chords, called triads. A triad simply means 3 notes stacked in thirds. They have a special shape and a special sound, and they actually make up the bulk of tonal music. They comprise pretty much what we think of as harmony, them and their extensions, which we'll later learn are 7th chords. But since they're so central to music, we're going to spend quite a lot of time working with them. We need to see first how a triad is a stack of thirds. Here we have a C and an E. We can imagine the C as being a root note that's going to generate the chord above it. So we start with just the interval of a third, C, E. To imagine the stack of thirds, we now need to place another note above the E, and a third above E would be G. The 3 notes blend together very well, and they create a sort of a thickened C-ness to them. And the 3 ingredients of this chord, again, are called the root, the third, and the fifth. And the root, C, defines the chord. What's remarkable is that, at least by letter name, which is what we've been working with, only 7 triads exist. There are 7 letter names in music, so there are only 7 ways to structure a stack of thirds above them. There's an A triad, a B triad, well, etc., all the way up to the G triad. The presence of accidentals, just as in the case of intervals, doesn't actually change the letter structure of the chord itself. So whether I play A, C, E, that's an A triad, or I play A, C sharp, E, that's also an A triad. And even if I change the A to be an A flat, C, E, which is a very sort of unusual sound compared to the major and minor triads that I played, the letter name structure of A, C, E remains. It may have a different flavor depending on the use of the sharps and flats, but the A, C, E remains constant. And what's important about this is that we can use this grid to decide if we're dealing with triads or not. If it's an A, C, E of any kind, it must be a triad. And if it's A, B, E with a second in it, I said A, B, so clearly I'm not dealing with a third, it's not a triad. It's critical that you memorize these 7 triad structures. Everything that we'll do in music will reduce down to one of these 7 types of chords, or possibly an extension of them. But these serve as the building blocks of all harmony. And it's not too hard to do. It's like thinking every other number when you're doing number counting. Counting by evens or odds is not very hard, and thinking of every other note is not very hard. If I have A, C, E, A, skip the B, C, skip the D, E, I have A, C, E. If I were to continue that string, I'd go A, C, E, and then honestly, if I move over here to this E, I can imagine an E triad by going every other letter upwards. E, forget the F, G, forget the F, B. So it's always possible to derive these 7, any one of these chords, just from your knowledge of note space. But at the same time, it's very useful to think BDF is a chord and EGB is a chord. And I'm just naming here what a B triad would be and what an E triad would be. Here we'll begin identifying some triads, and these will be of the easier format. The first sounds and looks like a triad. We can see from the staff there's every other space is highlighted here or covered by a note head, and it, like I said, it looks like a triad. It is DFA, and in this case is a simple D triad. But what's important is that a triad might be spread out or thickened or take lots of forms, and then we have to always reduce the letter names that are above into one of the 7 configurations below. So the second chord, there's this, right? That also sounds like a pretty blended sonority. If we check, we'll actually see that it's from the bottom up, it's a G, a B, and a D, and that does reduce to one of the note stacks. Abstractly, it is a G chord, GBD. Third chord I've already given away the cookies, but again, it looks like a triad. In this case, there's a flat in the middle of it. It changes the expected C sonority like this to this, but it doesn't change the fact that there's C, E, and G present. It is a C triad. The fourth chord similarly has accidentals. It has an F sharp, A, C sharp. In this case, the actual root, or lowest number of the letter stack, is altered. If we had to match it up to one of the 7, we'd see it fits FAC. And in this case, the proper name for this chord is an F sharp triad. And then the last chord here looks like it has more than 3 notes, but all of them are going to be duplicates. So the fact that there's a lot of A's, A's, and A's, there's 3 A's in this chord, but there's also a C and an A. And together, these 5 notes only comprise the notes A, C, and E. So the doublings don't really matter. It's still an ACE chord and an A triad. Then things get a little more complicated. This is starting to look a little bit more like real music. It sounds like this. And a couple of complications arise here. The first chord, again, has more than 3 notes, but if we looked at the A, C sharp, E, and A, the 2 A's don't really matter. It's still an ACE chord of some kind, and it's an A chord. The second chord is much more interesting for our purposes. Here we only have a C sharp and an A. And it happens to be that when you're doing chordal analysis that it's always possible to omit the 5th of any triad. So in this case, a C sharp and an A still boil down to really being an A, C sharp, E chord, and the E is just simply not present. Given 2 notes, you should expect that one of them is the root and one of them is the third. If there's a note missing, it's probably the 5th of the chord. So if we had to structure A and C sharp together, it's probably not an F sharp chord with no root in it. It's probably not any kind of F chord. It has to be a C sharp A together make also an A chord. And if I play these first 2 chords together, you'll note that they sort of sound similar. It's not quite as thick as the first chord, but they sort of sound like the same entity twice, just with a different flavor. The third chord, something different's happened compared to the other triads we've seen before. So the game remains the same. We're trying to reduce this stack of notes into one of our recognizable letter stacks. So we have a G sharp below, an E, and then a B. So the question is, which of those 7 letter names could it be? Some people might be tempted to say, oh, well, I've done this before. I've seen G or G sharp at the bottom, so it's probably a G chord. And that doesn't work in this case, because we know that G triads are GBD chords, and that doesn't work because there's no B and there's no D above. It actually can't be a G triad because the 3 letters that we have here don't reduce to a GBD stack. So we have to try a different note. It's not G. If we try the E, can we make a 3rd stack from E? And the 3rd stack from an E chord is some sort of EGB chord. And that's exactly what we have here. If you notice that there's an E here, a G sharp here, and a B here, and together those make EGB. It just happens to be that one of the notes has been scrambled. It's put in the bass, but the 3 notes present in the chord are E, G sharp, and B. The last chord is at the downbeat not ambiguous. It's not hard to tell what this is. At the downbeat of the next measure, we have an A, an E, and a C sharp. That reduces very nicely to a root position or basic A chord. So that's not really a problem. What is a problem is that there are some notes floating around that don't belong to A, that don't belong in the A, C sharp, E triad. The note B feels like sort of a interloper. It doesn't belong. It's got a great, beautiful sound. But the C sharp above it, that starts the measure, and the A that it gets to at beat 2 feel like part of the A chord, and the B is really not part of that chord. So for a moment, we say that that note is passing in between members of the chord. Given A, C sharp, and E as the foundation of this measure, There's another note in the melody that doesn't fit the A chord, and that's this G sharp that happens right before the end of the measure. Again, that G sharp also feels like it doesn't fit the harmony. It happens to be the leading tone of A, and it feels like it wants to move back to A. Instead of passing between members of the A triad, this one is sort of going away and back, starting at this A, going down to G sharp, and back up to A. And that shape of away and back is called a neighbor figure. And what we do here is we actually circle, or in this case square, but usually it's you draw a circle around what are called the non-chord tones. And the B natural doesn't fit the chord, the G sharp doesn't fit the chord, but ultimately we would say this is an A chord that has some non-chord tones happening in it. Below we have one more musical example, and it doesn't at the surface look like there are any chords at all happening here. And this is what the melody sounds like. And what's remarkable is that even though there are no simultaneities or block chord structures happening, it's still possible to see that this melody actually projects a sense of chord progression. If we look, the leapiness of the first measure should remind you of the notes of a chord. And the composer probably had in mind a chordal sonority. The melody only plays one note at a time, but there's still that strong sense of A major. If we look to the second measure, again, it's very leapy, and the three notes sort of all work together to create a sense of a chord. In this case, if we had to reduce the G sharp, the E, and the B to a chord, they all fit within the third stack of E, G, B. The second chord is, in fact, an E chord of some kind. It's just sort of unfolded out or spooling out horizontally. The third measure, the first three notes are a direct arpeggiation, as what musicians call that when they sort of skip among the notes of a chord. In this case, we're back to that entire measure consists of notes from, again, the A, C sharp, E triad. It's an A chord. And then the last measure looks like a scale, but if we take just the metric emphasis of the B, G sharp, and regard the other notes as passing, we have this sort of sense of E. And to confirm the rightness of this view, we can simply just try the alternating chords of A and E. Here's A, E, A, E. It agrees perfectly, and of course I can tell you as the composer, those are the four chords I had in mind when I wrote the melody. So that's a demonstration of how even a simple melody can strongly project a sense of harmony.